So let's take a look at the lesson objectives for 10.1. We're going to talk about Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. We're going to describe observations that Darwin made on his 5-year voyage on the Beagle. And we're going to look at some of the influences that developed as the evolutionary theory developed. And we're going to explain how a species can evolve through natural selection. Darwin's theory of evolution really had two major ideas in it. One is that evolution occurred. In other words, organisms change over time. Now that might seem obvious to us because we see the flu virus changing every year, and we can see other smaller animals like bacteria changing. But in Darwin's time, most people thought that once a life form was created, it never changed. So that was a big idea. The other, and really the reason that Darwin gets so much credit, is because he was able to figure out how evolution occurred by natural selection. And natural selection is the process in which living things with beneficial traits produce more offspring than others do. In Darwin's day, most people believed that all the species were created at the same time and remained unchanged. And many people believed that the Earth was only 6,000 years old. As we saw in the previous chapter, though, we know the Earth is much, much older. In 1831, a very young Charles Darwin was given a chance to get on the HMS Beagle as the ship's naturalist. This was an amazing opportunity for young Charles Darwin. As the naturalist, his job was to observe and collect specimens of plants, animals, rocks, and fossils, and he would send them back to London, England, and became, in the 5 years that he was away, really gathered quite a reputation just from the fossils, just from the plants and animals that he sent back. People were intrigued in the 1830s when a naturalist would go abroad. As you can see from this picture, they left Plymouth, England, they traveled down, and the main job of the boat was to map the coast of South America, then up to the Galapagos and over down to Australia, around Africa, and back up to England. The entire trip in a very small HMS Beagle took 5 years. Some of Darwin's observations was, I'd like you to read through this section, is that he saw tropical rainforests for the first time. He saw plants and animals that he had never seen. One time he was off the coast of South America and he saw an earthquake lift up the ocean floor 9 feet above sea level. So he knew that geology played a big role in changing life. He visited rock ledges that were once beaches but had gradually built up over time. He saw that the Earth's processes could be slow and would take a long time. He also dug up fossils of gigantic extinct mammals, mammals like the ground sloth that we'll see down here in this picture. This was one of the fossils that he was able to dig up. On the Galapagos, which is just off the coast of South America, Darwin saw Galapagos tortoises. And one of the really interesting stories of this was the governor of the Galapagos said, "Hey, I can tell you what island a tortoise was on just from the shape of its shell." So the governor said, "See this shape? That means it was on this island, a rather arid island. It didn't have a lot of vegetation, so that this tortoise would have to reach up further, and this was an advantage to him. Whereas if you if you were a tortoise that lived on a lush island, you didn't have a need for that, so you didn't evolve something like that." Some of the people that influenced Darwin were these three. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, I'd like you to read about him, and his idea of inheritance from acquired characteristics was incorrect, but his biggest contribution to Darwin was that life did change. Charles Lyell, who was a personal friend of Darwin's, wrote a book on geology about how old the Earth was, which was a big influence. And there was also an English economist by the name of Thomas Malthus who wrote a book on population. And he stated that when populations became too large, famine and disease break out. In the end, this keeps populations in check. There are other ideas from Malthus that helped Darwin, so please read and understand those. One of the ideas that really helped Darwin see that life could change was the idea of artificial selections. So in artificial selection, human beings pick what animals they want to breed of a particular species. For example, most pigeons start out like this, but if we breed them artificially, if we select for the traits we want, we can breed a carrier pigeon, or we can breed these white pigeons, these white fantail pigeons over here. So Darwin was very curious about anyone who bred animals, or plants for that matter. So for example, dogs, all dogs, come from a common gray wolf. And Darwin was fascinated that Europeans and North Americans and people in China or India bred dogs for different characteristics. And he thought to himself, well, if we can change life artificially, I wonder if it can be changed naturally. Darwin returned from his 5-year voyage in 1836. He never went on a ship again, and he continued to write and practice and experiment as soon as he got home. And it took him many, many years to reach his conclusion. He was very hesitant about publishing his book. But let's look at some of the ideas. Like Lamarck, Darwin assumed that species can change over time. The fossils he found really helped him with that. From Lyell, he knew that the Earth was very, very old, so there was enough time for evolution to work and form the diversity of life. From Malthus, he knew that overproduction of offspring led to a struggle for existence. From artificial selection, those dog breeders, the pigeon breeders, the cat breeders, the plant breeders, Darwin knew that offspring have chance variations that can be inherited. And those chance variations might aid in the struggle for existence. Darwin coined the term fitness to refer to an organism's relative ability to survive and produce fertile offspring. He knew that artificial selection could change domestic species over time, so he thought, I wonder if natural selection could also change species. Before we get to the Section 10.1 lesson summary, I'd like to tell you a story about these two gentlemen. Here's Charles Darwin, and here is Alfred Russel Wallace. Darwin, when he came back from his trip in 1836, started to experiment and started to write. But he started that in 1836, and he still, 23 years later, in 1859, he accrued a lot of evidence and a lot of writings, but he didn't publish his book. He was very hesitant to publish his book. He said to a close friend, he said, it's almost like revealing a murder. He didn't want to, he knew that it would cause people a lot of trouble. In 1859, this young man, Alfred Russel Wallace, on the other side of the world, who knew Darwin, wrote him a letter. And when Darwin saw the letter, he said to his close friend, Charles Lyell, oh my gosh, this guy has talked about evolution by natural selection. He has it right here in this 5-page letter. Well, what happened was they both decided to speak at the same night to the Royal Society, and both of them were given evidence. But Alfred Russel Wallace knew that Darwin had worked 23 years on this and very much believed that Darwin should be given all of the credit for natural selection being the mechanism by which evolution works. So for the summary here, Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, make sure you read through the 4 bullet points and understand them and who he was influenced by, and the role of Wallace's paper. All of that's in section 10.1, and we'll see you for 10.2 in a little bit.